Alrighty, well, good morning, peace. How's everybody doing this morning? If you're not awake, probably after that sound check, you're awake now. Maybe it was the Holy Spirit knocking on your heart. So you wake up. It's time to praise the Lord, all right? All right, let's all stand for our first song. It's called King of Glory. Here we go. And Christy's going to lead us off. So, here we go.
morning icon, click check in, write your name, what service you're attending, hit send, and that's all. Or you can also write your name in the main line, especially if you're a guest. Remember, it's one or the other. You don't have to do both. And if you're a guest, welcome. Stop by one of our welcome counters for a sweet treat. Also, with your app, you can follow along with survey notes, check the calendar, give, sign up for events, and so much more. Speaking of signing up for events, if you prefer using the Let's Connect card, write your event name in the box. Another way to stay connected is to follow us on social media.
Let's talk about what's going on at Peace. If you're new or just want some more information, join us for Pizza with the Pastors. This is a lunch immediately following the service where you can meet with Pastor Bill and some of the other pastors, ask some questions, eat some pizza in a friendly setting. So, if you're interested, sign up on the app or write pizza on the Let's Connect card.
Experience, you want to fix it, so you want to push a mission, wishing you good morning. Please pray for us that we will be able to spread God's love and for God to show up in a mighty way this week.
Don't forget, VBS is coming soon. It's June 24th through the 28th, so remember to register online for regular registration at $15 per kid. There is also a donation list for supplies. Another way you can help is by volunteering. Getting to meet a new group of energetic kids every year is a blessing. VBS never fails to give me hope for the next generation of believers. Consider being a leader to support these kids in their ever-growing faith journey. Why can't you play cards on a safari? There's too many cheetahs. Let's continue to worship God together.
Is this me? You're pointing to me. I've got to do this, right? How's everybody doing? I'm going to talk for a minute. I'm getting the signal. This is the offering time. This is our giving to the Lord. And after we do that, we're going to have 3 songs in a row. We're going to have a chance to lift up his name this morning and give the Lord praise. So before we give the offering, let's say a quick word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we just lift you up this morning, and we just want to give honor and praise to you. You are our King, you are our Lord, you are our Savior, and we just want to give our all, not just of ourselves and the things that we do, but also our 10%, our tithes. And we just want to give that to you this morning, Lord, and give you all the praise in Jesus' name. Everyone said? Amen. All right, song is called Holy Spirit. Just let the Holy Spirit speak to you this morning. Let him just speak to your heart and just lift up. You don't have to lift up the instrument. Let me know if you feel the Lord leading that. Do that. But just lift up your heart, lift up your voice to him. And let's listen as Pauline leads us this morning. picture with me Moses standing in front of a burning bush, having a conversation with God, where God actually invites Moses to go back to Egypt to confront a king, where God would demonstrate his power through amazing miraculous signs and lead people out of their bondage in Egypt into a promised land, a promise that has gone back for over 400 years to Moses' ancestors, and where God basically promises Moses that there will be success at every step on the journey. What do you say to that kind of invitation? Let me tell you how Moses responded to that invitation. He said, please send somebody else. Moses said no, and the reason why he said no may be the exact same reason why we continue to be paralyzed by voices from our past. See, Moses was an outsider. And that feeling that you don't belong, or you're not the same, and you don't fit in. You see, Moses believed that your past has defined you, and it will limit everything you do in your future. And I'm so glad that Moses was completely wrong. My name is Scott Drummond. I am the Director of Operations here at the church, and today we are starting a brand new series called Exit, in case you didn't figure it out. In this series, we're going to be taking a look at two things. First of all, we're going to look at one of the biggest events in biblical history, the exodus of the Hebrew people from a life of slavery to
a look at the journey through the life of Moses and see the steps that he took on his journey, knowing that the journey of Moses could be our journey also. And so we'll get back to Moses in just a little bit, but it's important for us to see the big picture of this story. Now, I should have a picture back here. Here we go. And I'm going to get out my pointer. Can you see this? Timeline starts about 2000 BC, okay? So a long time ago. And it's going to start with an individual. His name is Abraham. Now, God had this little conversation with Abraham where God said to Abraham, hey, Abraham, I'm going to make you the father of a nation, and then ultimately I will bring salvation to the entire world through you. And so Abraham is like, sounds pretty cool. And so Abraham, then he had a son, and his son's name was, fill in the blank. There was like 2% confidence in the room on that answer. Abraham had a son, and his son was Isaac. Isaac had a son, and his son was Jacob. 4 of you like, okay, this is why we have Sunday school. Abraham had Isaac. Isaac had Jacob. And then let me help you with the next one. Jacob had how many sons? That's 12. Good job. And like this one, like the second to last one or so, his name was Joseph. Joseph became famous because he did a musical called The Technicolor Dreamcoat. But what also made him famous was he was Dad's favorite. Which, can you imagine this? You got 12 boys and you're like, I'm literally picking a favorite. Now, as parents, we don't officially have favorites, but Jacob had a favorite. And he gave him like this special wardrobe. And here's the thing, Joseph loved that he was the favorite. And he basically rubbed it in his brother's face that he was the favorite and the rest of them were not Dad's favorite. So here's the thing. When you have, how many of you grew up with like more than 4 boys in the house? Anybody? Okay, 3 boys. There's a few of you have 3 boys. Other word for 3 boys is like chaos, right? Imagine 12 boys. Okay, quick side note, there's also like 3 moms, which talk about, there's a whole other world of crazy going on. 12 boys, you've got 1 boy that's the favorite. He's rubbing it into everybody else, which is not helping things. And so there's a group of the boys that they literally want to kill Joseph. But the nice brothers say, let's just sell him into slavery. Like those were the good brothers. So they sell him into slavery, okay? And so then Joseph gets sold into slavery and goes to Egypt. You're starting to catch along. These are pictures that represent things. So it goes to Egypt. And what the brothers don't realize is, they think they basically just signed his death warrant. He's sold off. They're never going to see him again. What happens is there is a drought in the entire region. And the boys didn't prepare for it. But they heard a rumor that Egypt did prepare for the famine. And so they go to Egypt, and little do they know that little brother they sold into slavery actually became second in command for all of Egypt. And it was his idea to prepare for the coming famine. So the boys come back, they apologize greatly, and Joseph, with his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, he gives forgiveness to his brothers. His brothers get all their families, and they all move to Egypt because Egypt had prepared for the famine. So what happens next is we've got this little space in here. That little space takes about 400 years. And let me tell you what's going on in this 400 years. You've got the entire family, the 12 boys are all together now, and they've got spouses, and they're having kids, and their kids are having kids. And the Bible, like if you look at the original Hebrew, it's like says they multiplied like rabbits, which isn't actually in the Hebrew, but it should be. What is in the Bible, it says they started to multiply like crazy, to the point that the king of Egypt was starting to get freaked out a little bit because he's seeing how quickly these Hebrews are multiplying. He's doing the math. He's saying, if we don't do something, then they're going to overpopulate us, and they're going to kick us out of our own land. And so step number 1 for the solution was just put them all into slavery. Work them hard. And so you have generation upon generation of Hebrew people that were born slaves, they lived life as a slave, and they would die as a slave. Generation after generation. This would affect your collective mindset. This would affect your way of living. This would affect your attitude, your actions, and your belief system. If all you ever knew and everyone you were ever related to only remembers a life of slavery. Because here's the thing. When you are not free, all you know how to do is try to survive. So this is where Moses comes in. So even in the middle of slavery and the Hebrews being oppressed, how do I say this without getting in trouble? Bill's not here, it doesn't matter. The Hebrews, they're still multiplying like crazy. So it's like slavery didn't work. They only had one pastime. So that was also a joke. You're going to get it later. So the new king in this generation, the new king of Egypt, he's incredibly threatened. And so what happens is he devises a plan. And it is an evil, horrible plan. His plan is every newborn baby, every Hebrew newborn baby boy, is to be thrown into the river. There are these 2 young Hebrews, husband and wife. They get pregnant, they have a baby, and what should be an amazing, joyous part of your life. The baby's born, it's a boy. Can you imagine what that would feel like? Those young parents did what any of us would have done. They hid that baby as long as they could, but they were about 3 months in, realizing it's only a matter of time before this baby is discovered. So with an act of complete desperation, they get some reeds and they weave a basket and they try to waterproof this thing as best as possible. And then they take their 3-month-old, put him in the basket, and put the basket in the river. And then they hope for a miracle. The miracle did come. It came in the form of the king's daughter who saw the basket, rescued the baby, and then decided to raise the baby as her own. Now, at first glance, growing up in a palace with royal family sounds pretty amazing. Some of you have always thought Buckingham Palace, you could be royalty. You like that kind of life. It seems like it would be pretty good. But what happens when you get older and you start to realize, as Moses did, that you look different than everyone else in the palace? You're told of the controversial stories around your birth and your mother. And maybe there's a chance that Moses would fight those thoughts in his head that thinks in terms of, did my parents just abandon me? Did they reject me? Did they not try hard enough to keep me? Or was I just not wanted? Which none of those were true. But isn't it amazing some of the stories we tell ourselves? Then for Moses, the older you get, the more different he probably realized he was. He didn't fit in. He's a different race. His grandfather is an evil racist. So what do you feel as a child in that kind of home? What do you feel when you don't fit in? When others make fun of you? When you're not fully accepted? See, Moses also had a speech impediment. There was one of the versions of the Bible say that he stuttered. And so we all know how cruel people can be with someone who is different. And if you're different, then don't you just start to question who you are? Some of you know this feeling, and I believe that this was also true of Moses. So what happens to us in childhood has the ability to affect the rest of our life. It can define who we are, how we feel about ourselves, our outlook on life, and certainly would affect our insecurity. I believe it affected Moses. I believe Moses, one of the most revered characters in the entire Bible, I believe he struggled with who he was. He struggled with his identity, and he was riddled with insecurity. He was not the obvious choice to be the one who would lead an entire nation, but he was God's choice. And that is what made Moses the unlikely hero. See, Moses got older, and there was a day where he saw an Egyptian beating another Hebrew slave. And I'm guessing that just rage churned within him. He didn't think anyone was seeing, but he went and he attacked the Egyptian, killed him, buried the body. Didn't think it would be discovered, but it was. But what happens next is not what we would probably think would happen. Because if you have somebody in the palace that does something wrong, there would probably, usually, be some sort of cover-up, don't you think? There would be some way to wash over the problem. If you've got a royal that did something wrong, we don't want it to be any more public. We're going to make up stories. This is not what happened. In fact, our racist grandfather king, he puts out a death sentence over his Hebrew adopted grandchild. So Moses was reminded once again that when it comes down to it, his family will choose their people over what he thought was his own family. So what did Moses do? He ran. He ran as fast as he could. He headed east. He headed east out of Egypt. He would end up in the high desert of what would be modern-day Saudi Arabia. It was there that he would find a family, a nomad type of family, and he would marry a woman and start to have his own kids, and he became a shepherd. And his entire life would be about walking for miles and miles and for days and days and weeks on weeks just to find fresh greens for the animals to eat on. This was his role, a far cry from where he started in the palace of Egypt. But then there was one particular day that you probably know about. In fact, even if you're not a church person and you're not very familiar with the Bible, there's a really good chance that you've at least heard part of this story. It's a story where Moses is up in the highlands and he sees this bush that is burning. And the Bible goes on to explain it kind of took Moses by surprise because it wasn't being consumed. And so Moses went up to the burning bush, and which seems a little weird, let's be honest. And then the burning bush starts talking, even more weird. And the burning bush says, hey, don't come any closer unless you take off your shoes, because where we are right now is holy ground. And so all of a sudden, Moses starts to realize he is actually having this conversation, this burning bush conversation with God. And God starts to lay out a plan for Moses. And this is what God says. This is coming out of Exodus chapter 3, starting in verse 7, where God says, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers. I'm concerned about their suffering. So we're hearing even the empathy of God here. God continues, so I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home to the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me. And I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. And then look at verse 10 with me. So, this is God saying, now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. So God's plan to save the Hebrews, send Moses back to Egypt and have him bring them all out. Now, I believe what happens next in this conversation, which I personally think is one of the most fantastic conversations that somebody has with God in the entire Bible. I think it's kind of fun. But what we're going to see is this conversation being driven by Moses' insecurity and his self-image that I think comes from his past. So, let's look at that conversation. So Moses says to God, this is like the first thing out of his mouth after God says, we're going back in. Moses says, who am I that I should go do this? His very first question is like, hey God, I'm pretty darn sure you've got the wrong person. I'm pretty sure I'm not qualified, I'm not good enough, I am not who you're looking for. And so Moses is saying, God, who am I that I should go? God's response to this was, I will be with you, which really isn't answering the question of who am I. But God is starting to insert a narrative here of saying, I am going to be here with you the whole time. Well, Moses isn't convinced. The very next thing he says is, so what if I go? What if? I'm not saying I will. What if I go and they ask me, what is the name of the God who sent me? And God's response to Moses was, Tell them my name is I am. And Moses is probably thinking, that's not helpful. And God's like, okay, they want my full name? My full name is I am that I am. Again, God, not very helpful. At which point, I'm thinking, Moses is like, what is going on here? Well, God continues. God says, Moses, here's the thing. I want you to go back to Egypt, and you're going to go to the Hebrew people, and you're going to talk to the elders. And God is speaking prophetically. He's saying, they're going to listen to you. Then I want collectively, all the elders and you, to go to the king of Egypt. However, he's not going to listen to you. But then we're going to do some crazy miracles, and eventually they're going to listen to you, and then they're going to let all of you go and leave out of Egypt. Moses responds, but what if they think I'm making this up and don't believe me? Let's be honest. That's an entirely valid question. Absolutely valid. Because if I came up to you right after church and I said, hey, I was working in my backyard yesterday, and I was talking to a bush. Nice little conversation. But the bush put me in charge and said that you should follow me. Like, how many of you would listen to that? It's like, this is not normal. And so I completely understand the fact that Moses is like, this just all sounds completely ridiculous. Well, at this point, God is like, all right, I want to show you that I am with you, that I have power and I have authority, and we can do this. So God says to Moses, Moses, what's in your hand? And Moses says, a staff. And God says, throw your staff on the ground. And so Moses throws the staff on the ground. And the staff turns into a snake. And then God says, pick up the snake. And Moses says, no, I hate snakes. He didn't say that. But he picked up the snake. Then as soon as he picked it up, it turned back into a staff. And God's like, cool, isn't it? And then God says, let me see your hand. And Moses shows him his hand. And God says, take your hand, put it in your cloak. Pull it back out again. He pulls it back out again. And it's all leprous. It's white and scaly. God says, put your hand back in your cloak. Pull it back out again. When he pulls it back out again, it's perfectly clean. God says, cool, isn't it? I think Moses is like, so I got a couple cool parlor tricks. What's going on here? And then God says, one more thing. If you go back to Egypt and they don't believe you, show them the staff trick. If they don't like that, show them the hand trick. If that doesn't look good, then go to the Nile, get a pitcher of water, pour the water onto the ground. It's going to turn into blood. Kind of gross, but it will be convincing. And so God is like saying, I'm going to do this. I'm here. There's no limits for me. All power is with me. And Moses, I'm with you. And then Moses replies, okay, but are you catching the theme here? But I'm not eloquent with my speech. I stutter. And you get the idea in the passage when you read it, and I encourage you, this is Exodus chapter 4. Go home and read chapter 3 and chapter 4 and watch this thing come alive for you. But you get the idea that God's almost a little irritated. Because God's response is, hey, Mo. He didn't say Mo, he says Moses. Who created your mouth? And who created language? All rhetorical questions. In other words, God was saying, I am Lord of all of it. So Moses, this is not a big deal for me. I have it covered. I'm with you. So don't worry about your speech. Don't worry if people will believe you. Don't worry if they're going to ask questions you don't have answers to. Don't worry about it all, because we are going to do this together. And Moses' response to all of this was the verse where we started, where Moses says, I don't want to be rude, but please send someone else. Moses just couldn't see past his own insecurity. And maybe we can't either. See, there was a theme emerging in this whole conversation. There's a theme for Moses, and there was a theme for God. The theme for Moses was all centered around this idea of, I'm not who you're looking for, and I can't do this, and I don't have the ability, and you have the wrong person. And the theme for God was, I choose you. I will be with you. I will empower you. I will go with you. We will do this together. So maybe this is you. When you look at who you are and you don't like who you see, and every voice in your head screams at you that you're not good enough. You hear sentences play over and over again that start with these three words. But I am, and you fill in the blank. But I am divorced. But I am dyslexic. But I am uneducated. But I am insecure. But I am a failure. But I am not good enough. But I am a foster kid. How often do we not do something because there is a self-image problem? A voice from our past, a definition over our life that tells us that we are not good enough, we will fail, and we should never try. So we turn down opportunities because we don't think we are good enough. We don't take the first step in a new direction because there is no way we can even imagine ourselves doing it. Or we just tolerate the rejection around us because we believe that somehow we deserve it. I want to tell you how our little story ends. This little interaction, this conversation with God ends. And quite honestly, it might be my favorite part of the story. There's no real hoopla around it. Because the Bible doesn't finish the story by letting us know that Moses actually said yes to God. It doesn't. It's not like God circled back and said, okay, one last time. Will you go to Egypt? It doesn't happen. You've got all the excuses of Moses, and then it just kind of ends. But something else does happen. The only thing we see is that Moses, he just takes a step in the right direction. So it's not like Moses was like, you know what, God? I love it. I believe it. I believe everything you just said to me. I've totally looked at my life in the wrong way. I've doubted myself. I've been insecure my whole life. I thought I was not wanted and I was rejected and everything changed. That's not the story. But the story is Moses taking a step in the right direction. Here's the point of today. Track with me. God is not looking for the capable and the ready. He's not looking for those who feel like they have been set up for this moment in their life. He's looking for those who are just willing to take a step. So whatever deficiencies you have and you see in yourself, God is saying, well, guess what? I'm just going to make up all the difference. And that's the point. It's about what He can do. It's not about what you can't do. So your story, your personal life story, may have started with a really, really hard childhood that may have carried over to where you are today. But I want you to know that this story with Moses, it's supposed to be your story also. God chose Moses, and God chooses you. This journey of life that we are all on, we are not alone. God is actually with us. He is here. He chooses us. He loves us. He accepts us. He will walk with us. He will empower us. This is the point of the story. One more thing. Moses wasn't fixed before he started his journey. You know, sometimes we think that we got to get all the junk together before we do something. We got to get healed from all the past hurts before we can take another step. Moses didn't get all his life figured out before he did this. He started the journey, and then he began to actually grow. And here's the thing. I don't think we get fixed from our past anyway. But there are some things from our past that become narratives in our life. And I believe that we can learn a new narrative. We can rewrite that story in our head. And some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. Because when it's quiet and you don't hear any other external voice, there is that one voice in your head that tries to remind you of how poor and bad and unqualified and rejected you are. And I'm saying, I believe God is writing a new narrative. It's a narrative that says things like, I'm not alone. Even though your whole life has felt like you are. It's a new narrative that says, but God chose me. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Because he loves me. A narrative that says, God wants to do this with me. That's a different perspective, and it's a different mindset. It's a rewriting of the narrative. And my hope is that for some of us here today, because you have had 100 voices in your past that have spoken some things to you, and they've become these overwhelming, evil, negative voices in your head, but they have controlled who you are and how you see yourself. And my prayer over you today is you can start to see that just like with Moses, there is a new narrative for you. You are chosen and God loves you. And you are not alone. And he picks you. And he's with you and he's never going to leave you. And my hope is that that narrative can start to be on repeat. And I think little by little, it's going to start to become a dominant voice. And my prayer is that the volume of those voices of your past will start to go down. Doesn't mean those voices disappear, but it's a volume issue. And if we can start to hear the new narrative, no, you are chosen. God is with you every day, every moment. And it's not about what you do or how good you are or how well you performed or where you came from or who you're related to. It's just because he loves you. Your past does not define who you are. And whether you believe it or not, God has chosen you. He's chosen you to be an unlikely hero. Let's pray. Holy God, I thank you that this story you gave us, this great epic story of bringing your nation from slavery to freedom, the great metaphor of salvation that is. Lord, I pray that that same truth would shine itself in our hearts and our lives, that especially For those of us that are in this room, in this moment, hearing my voice, where they can't stand how they feel about themselves. I pray that your voice and your narrative would start to ring true. That they would be healing words, that you are with us, and you love us, and you are here. And Lord, I know that for all of us in this room, there is a forward, there is a next step. And for some of us, we have been afraid to take it because we just can't picture anyone like us ever doing anything like that. But God, I am believing that just like you called Moses to do something, that it wasn't about his ability at all, but it was about your ability. I pray you help us to do the simple thing that Moses did and take the next step. Even though it may feel like it goes against everything that we're wired to do or believe about ourselves. But we're going to trust that you are with us. You are taking care of us. And you will be here always. We thank you, Lord. We pray this in Jesus' mighty name. Amen.
Why don't everyone stand up on this last song? We stand before you now, the greatest of your renown. Have heard of your majesty and wonder of you, King of heaven. In humility I bow as your love, in wave after wave, crashes over me, crashes over me. For you are for us, you are not against us. Champion of heaven, you made a way for all to enter in.
how you look at your past will be completely different than how you look at your future. Up until this moment, some of us may have felt that our future has already been written because of where we came from. But this is the point, not just of the story that we talked about today. This is the point of the entire gospel in the Bible. Because of who Jesus is and what he did and what he does, it means that no matter what is in the rearview mirror, today is new. And our future is new. There may have been a life of bondage in our past, but there is promise in our future, and we've been invited along for the journey. I pray you all have an amazing week. We love you all. God bless you all. Take care.
As your love
And wave after wave crashes over me, crashes over